Begin with a city that has outlived its own greatness. Picture Rome in the 10th century, not the Rome of marble and legions and the roar of the crowd, but the quiet one that came afterward. The great halls stand, but they stand cracked. The columns hold up nothing. In the Forum, where the fate of the known world was once argued out under an open sky, cattle move slowly through the long grass, and the only sound is the soft tearing of grass at the root. The people who live here have built their houses into the ribs of ancient buildings, sheltering beneath arches raised by men whose language they can no longer fully read. They warm themselves with fires lit against walls that once held the offices of empire. And here is the paradox that opens our story tonight. In this city, the city of St. Peter, the heart of Western Christianity, the popes did not rule. A single family did. And within that family, in a palace that was also a fortress, a boy was being raised who would wear the highest spiritual crown in the West before he was old enough to grow a proper beard. His name was Octavian. His story is one of the strangest the papacy has ever known, and it ends, as so many strange stories do, in a question no one has ever fully answered. If you find peace in these quiet journeys through the past, click like and subscribe, but only if this place truly gives you rest. And if you feel like it, leave a comment telling us which city you are listening from and what time it is there right now. There is something quietly comforting in knowing that we are drifting off together from so many corners of the world at so many different hours of the night. Now, dim the lights in your room. Perhaps turn on a small fan for that gentle background hum that makes a room feel safe. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Uncurl your hands. Let your breathing slow until it is deeper than your thoughts. There is nothing you need to remember tonight, and nothing you need to do. Let us begin the journey together. To understand the boy, we must begin long before he was born, with the family that made him. By the 10th century, Rome was governed neither by emperors nor by an independent church. The old Western Empire had fallen centuries earlier, and what replaced it was thin, improvised, fragile. There was no great administration, there were no legions. There was a memory of order and a set of institutions too weak to enforce it. Into that emptiness stepped the men who were already there. The local aristocracy, the great Roman landholding families who owned the fields outside the walls and the towers inside them, and who understood that in a city without a state, power belongs to whoever can feed men and arm them. One family rose above all the rest. Historians call them the House of Theophylact, after the man who founded their fortunes. He was a senior official in the papal administration in the early 900s, and he understood something very simple, so simple that it seems almost obvious once it is said. Whoever controlled the city of Rome controlled the Pope, and whoever controlled the Pope controlled a source of wealth and prestige that reached out across all of Christendom, into kingdoms he would never see, among peoples whose names he barely knew. Theophylact was not a king, and he never claimed to be one. His titles sounded modest, almost clerical. Master of the soldiers, keeper of the wardrobe, senator of the Romans. Quiet words, the sort of words that appear on a document and are forgotten. But behind them sat something very real. He commanded the militia of the city. He held the treasury. He decided who rose and who fell, and he did it without ever needing to raise his voice. And crucially, he had a wife and daughters who were every bit as capable as he was, and who would carry his ambitions forward in ways that scandalized chroniclers for generations afterward. The most famous of them was his daughter, a woman named Marozia. She is one of the boldest figures of the entire medieval period, and she would become the grandmother of our young Pope. Marozia learned politics standing at her father's side, and she learned it thoroughly. Through marriages, through alliances, through a great deal of patience, she gathered the threads of Roman power into her own two hands. She arranged the elevation of popes who served her interests, She removed the ones who did not. At the height of her influence, she alone decided who sat upon the throne of St. Peter. And for a stretch of years she governed the city from a fortress on the banks of the Tiber, an ancient tomb that the Romans had hollowed and reinforced and turned into a stronghold, so that the dead emperor inside it kept watch over her while she slept. This was the world into which the family's children were born, not a world of gentle piety. A world of fortified towers rising above narrow streets, of private armies, of loyalties that shifted with the season, where the language of the church and the reality of street politics were tangled together so tightly that nobody could pull them apart. Later writers gave this era a grim and beautiful name. They called it the saeculum obscurum, the dark age of the papacy, a time when the office meant to guide souls had become, in practice, a prize to be won by whoever held the most spears inside the city walls. It would be easy to picture these Roman aristocrats as simple villains, greedy and godless, and to leave it at that. The truth is stranger and far more human. Many of them were sincerely religious, even as they manipulated the church for advantage. They funded monasteries. They endowed shrines. They walked long roads on pilgrimage in the dust and the heat. They saw no contradiction whatsoever in praying devoutly on Sunday and bribing a cardinal on Monday. Because to them, the church was not only a spiritual institution, it was the great public structure of their city, the one thing that still gave Rome meaning now that the legions and the emperors were gone. To control it was, in their own eyes, simply to take responsibility for Rome itself. And by the time our story properly begins, that responsibility had passed to a grandson of old Theophylact, a man named Alberic. He was the son of Marozia, and he had inherited every ounce of his mother's nerve, along with something harder that she had never quite possessed, a soldier's edge, a willingness to act before the moment had finished forming. Alberic would do what none of his ancestors had managed. He would take open, undisguised control of the whole city, and he would hold it for more than 20 years. And it was Alberic who would father the boy at the centre of our tale, and Alberic who would set in motion the chain of events that placed an untested teenager on the most sacred chair in the Western world. But before we follow that boy into the great basilica, we must understand his father. The strange life of Pope John XII makes no sense at all unless you first understand the man who built the cage of expectation around him. The prince who decided, while his son was still a child, exactly what that child's destiny would be. So let us turn to Alberic, and to the Rome he ruled with an iron and surprisingly steady hand. He came to power the way many strong men of that age did, through a single, sudden act of rebellion, taken in a room full of people, in front of witnesses, at exactly the moment when hesitation would have cost him everything. His mother, in her hunger for legitimacy, had arranged to marry a powerful outsider, a northern king named Hugh of Provence, a man who hoped that the marriage would carry him one step closer to the imperial crown. To the Romans, and above all to her young son, this did not look like a marriage. It looked like a foreign takeover of their city, conducted in the language of a wedding. Hugh was arrogant. He treated the Roman nobles as inferiors and made no effort to hide it. And according to the chroniclers, during the wedding festivities themselves, amid the wine and the noise and the smell of roasting meat, Hugh struck Alberic across the face. It is a small moment and easy to pass over, but feel it for a moment. The heat of a crowded hall, the sudden silence spreading outward from one open hand. A young man standing there with his cheek burning in front of every noble family in Rome, in his own city, in his mother's house. He did not forgive it. Alberic slipped out of the fortress that night and went into the streets. He gathered the citizens of Rome around him and called on them to rise. He reminded them, in words we no longer have, that they were the heirs of a great people, and he asked them whether they would truly accept a foreign master inside their own walls, in the city that had once ruled the world. and the Romans answered him. They came with whatever they had. They stormed the fortress on the river. King Hugh went over the wall by rope in the dark and fled the city, abandoning his new bride behind him. And Marozia, the woman who had made and unmade popes, who had governed Rome from a tomb, was seized by her own son and shut away. She vanishes from the record so completely from that moment that we do not even know the year of her death. Somewhere in Rome, in a room we cannot find, one of the most formidable women of the medieval world grew old in silence, and no one thought to write down when she stopped breathing. It was a cold thing to do to one's mother. But Alberic was not a sentimental man, and the result of that coldness was that, while still very young, he found himself the undisputed master of Rome. He did not take a royal title. He might have. Instead, he called himself the Prince and Senator of all the Romans, a phrase chosen with real care, echoing the old republic rather than any kingdom. He wanted the Romans to feel that he was one of them, a restorer of their ancient dignity rather than a tyrant imposed from outside. And for the most part, the strategy worked. For more than 2 decades, Alberic governed the city with a firmness that, by the chaotic standards of the age, looked almost like good government. He kept order in the streets. He defended the walls against threats from outside, including that same King Hugh, who tried more than once to force his way back in and never managed it. He managed the food supply, which in a medieval city is not a minor administrative detail, but the difference between peace and a riot. He maintained the fortifications, and he kept the popes firmly beneath his hand, treating the Holy Office as one department among several in his administration. During his rule, several popes came and went. Every one of them owed his position to Alberic, and every one of them understood exactly where real authority lay. This is the part of the story that modern listeners sometimes find hardest to accept. The Pope, the supreme head of the Western Church, the heir of St. Peter, was in this period essentially an appointee of a Roman strongman, expected to handle the spiritual duties of the office, while leaving the actual governing of the city to the prince. The two roles, the sacred and the secular, had been quietly pulled apart and set on separate tables. The Pope prayed and blessed and ordained. Alberic ruled. And yet, and this matters enormously for everything that follows, Alberic was not hostile to the Church. He was, in his own rough way, a genuine reformer. He took a serious and sustained interest in the monasteries of central Italy. He supported the work of a remarkable monk named Odo, abbot of a great reforming house in distant Burgundy, a man who had given his life to restoring discipline and holiness to religious communities that had grown comfortable and lax. Alberic invited him to Rome. He gave him authority over several monasteries and backed his work with the weight of princely power. He even handed over his own family fortress, standing on a hill inside the city, to be emptied of soldiers and turned into a monastery. So here is the shape of the man. Someone who manipulated the papacy ruthlessly for political ends, while at the very same time sincerely trying to make the deeper life of the Church purer than he had found it. To the people of the 10th century, there was no contradiction in this at all. To us, it can feel almost impossible to hold both ideas in one head at once. And it was in the middle of this long, stable, complicated reign that Alberic's son was born. The year was somewhere around 937, in a district of Rome that lay between the open ground of the old campus and one of the city's ancient hills. And they named the child Octavian. It was not a casual choice. Octavian had been the birth name of the first Roman emperor, the man later known as Augustus, who founded the imperial system 1,000 years before. To give that name to a child in 10th century Rome was to make a quiet, confident statement about what a family believed itself to be. These were people who genuinely thought of themselves as the inheritors of ancient Rome, and they wanted their children to feel the weight of that inheritance from the cradle onward, in the very sound of their own name being called across a courtyard. The boy's mother is a shadow. The most likely account gives her the name Alda, a woman connected by marriage to that same King Hugh whom Alberic had driven over the walls, joined to the family later as part of a peace settlement between old enemies. Other sources suggest the boy was born outside of marriage altogether, the son of a concubine. The records of this period are thin, and where they are not thin, they are hostile, and we cannot be certain. So she remains at the edge of the story, unnamed with any confidence, present in a way we can feel but never see. What we can say is this: Octavian grew up inside the household of the most powerful man in Rome. Soldiers and servants, clergy and courtiers moving through the rooms at all hours. A palace that was also a fortress, in a city that was also a ruin. He grew up, in other words, with an extraordinary inheritance and an extraordinary problem. The inheritance was the city of Rome itself and the family machine that controlled it. The problem was that his father had already decided, long before the boy could possibly have an opinion, exactly what shape that inheritance would take. Alberic did not intend simply to hand Rome to his son as a prince. He intended something far more ambitious and far more dangerous. We know frustratingly little about the childhood itself, and this is not unusual. Medieval chroniclers rarely wrote about the early years of even their greatest figures, because childhood was not thought of as a meaningful stage of life. A child was simply an adult who had not yet arrived, so we cannot follow the boy through his days. What we can do is reconstruct the world around him, the sights and the sounds and the expectations that filled his hours, and from that we can begin to understand the man he became. He was raised, first of all, inside power. From his earliest memories, the boy would have understood that his family was different. While ordinary Roman children grew up in cramped rooms built into the shells of ancient buildings, sharing walls with the past, Octavian grew up in his father's palace, with its guards at the doors, and its messengers arriving at strange hours, and its constant flow of important visitors, each one waiting to be received. He would have watched bishops bow to his father. He would have seen the heads of great families come to ask favours, and stand there while the answer was decided. He would have absorbed, without anyone ever needing to sit him down and explain it, the simple truth that his family commanded and others obeyed. And he was raised inside the church, though perhaps not in the way you might imagine. At some point in his boyhood, as part of his father's long plan, Octavian was placed into the clergy. He was made a cardinal deacon attached to one of the ancient churches of Rome, a small and dignified building on one of the city's hills. This did not mean that he spent his days in prayer and study, kneeling on cold stone like a humble monk. It meant that he held a churchly rank and a title, a place in the ecclesiastical structure, while continuing to live as the son and heir of the Prince of Rome. He wore the dress of a deacon when the occasion called for it. He rode out to hunt when it did not. This double life, begun in childhood, is the key to almost everything that followed. Octavian was never permitted to be simply a boy, and he was never permitted to be simply a churchman. He was raised to be a prince and a priest at once, with no real choice in either direction, and no one ever seems to have asked him which he would have preferred. And a child who is given enormous status without enormous responsibility, who is told from the beginning that he is destined for greatness but is never once made to earn it, often grows into precisely the kind of young man the chroniclers would later describe with such relish. We should be careful here because those sources are deeply hostile, and we will return more than once to the question of how far to trust them. But it is fair to say that the seeds of his later troubles were planted early, in this strange upbringing that asked nothing of him while promising him everything. What did the boy actually enjoy? Here the hostile accounts agree on a few points that carry the ring of truth precisely because they are so ordinary. Octavian loved horses. He loved hunting, riding out from the city into the hills and woods of the Roman countryside in the early cold, the breath of the horses showing in the air, the dogs running ahead through wet grass. He loved the company of other young men of his class, the sons of Roman nobility, with whom he could ride and feast and gamble late into the night. These were the pastimes of an aristocratic youth anywhere in Europe at the time, the perfectly normal pleasures of a privileged young man. The only difference, and it is an enormous difference, was that this particular young man was being groomed for the holiest office in the Western world. Pleasures that would have been entirely unremarkable in a young count looked very different indeed in a future pope. The education he received would have been the education of a Roman aristocrat, which, by the 10th century, had become a modest thing. The grand schools of the ancient world were long gone, their buildings quarried for stone like everything else. Literacy survived mainly inside the church, kept alive by monks bent over manuscripts in scattered houses across Europe, copying by hand what the world had nearly forgotten. A boy of Octavian's rank would have learned to read and probably to write. He would have absorbed the basics of Latin and the shape of the liturgy, enough to move through a ceremony without stumbling. And he would have been taught, with far greater care, the genealogies and rivalries and old grudges of the great families, knowledge worth infinitely more in 10th century Rome than any philosophy. He grew up understanding alliances and debts and favours, the practical machinery that holds a city together when nothing else will. This was a real education, and a valuable one. It simply was not the education that prepares a soul for spiritual leadership. Nothing in it asked him to look inward. Nothing in it taught him restraint, or how to sit with the weight of a decision, or how to be answerable to something larger than his own family's advantage. And all around him, his father's reign rolled steadily on, with its peculiar mixture of firmness and corruption. Octavian would have watched popes arrive and popes depart, each of them serving at his father's pleasure. He would have seen how the office worked from the inside, from the corridors rather than the nave, as a tool of family power rather than as a sacred trust. A boy who watches popes being made and unmade by his own father is unlikely to grow up with a deep, trembling reverence for the office. To Octavian, the papacy was never a distant mystery. It was the family business. And the family business, his father had decided, was going to be his. As Alberic grew older, he began to think about what would happen after his death. He had built a system that depended entirely on a strong man standing at its centre, and he understood, better than anyone, that such systems tend to collapse the moment that man is gone. Rivals would begin to circle. The other great families would sense the weakness in the air the way animals sense weather. The fragile peace of the city could shatter within a season. Alberic wanted to prevent that. And so he conceived a plan that was either brilliant or reckless, depending on where you stand and how the light falls on it. He would fuse the two sources of Roman power, the princely and the papal, into a single person, so that no rival could ever again play one against the other. And that single person would be his son. It was an enormous weight to place on the shoulders of a teenager. But Alberic was a man accustomed to gambling and to winning, and he set about securing his son's future with the same cold efficiency he had brought to everything else in his life. To do it, he would need the sworn cooperation of every powerful man in Rome, and he would extract that promise in the most solemn setting the city could offer. Around the year 954, Alberic knew that he was dying. He had ruled Rome for more than 20 years, longer than almost anyone in the city could easily remember. He had held it together through threats from outside the walls and rivalries within them. And now he faced the one problem that has always haunted men in his position. Power held by a single person is power that dies with that person, unless something is done to carry it across the gap. Alberic intended to do something. He intended to make his plan binding by the most powerful means available to a man of the 10th century. A sacred oath, sworn before God, in the holiest place in the city. He summoned the leading men of Rome, the nobles, the officials, the senior clergy, everyone whose cooperation would be needed to keep the city in his family's hands after he was in the ground. And he gathered them not in his palace, where such business was usually done, but in the great basilica of St. Peter, the burial place of the apostle himself, the spiritual heart of Western Christianity. Picture that gathering, the cold of old stone in the air, the smell of wax and of incense long since burned, lamps moving slightly in the draught. Beneath the ancient roof, surrounded by the tombs of saints and popes, a dying man asked these assembled Romans to swear. The Pope of the moment, Agapetus II, was a man Alberic had installed and could rely upon entirely. But Agapetus would not live forever, and so Alberic made the men of Rome swear that when the papal throne next fell vacant, they would elect his son Octavian as the next pope. It is worth pausing to feel how strange this moment was. Here was a layman, a secular prince with no priestly office at all, standing in the holiest church in the West, dictating in advance who the next pope would be, binding the great men of the city by sacred oath to install his own teenage son. The election of a pope was supposed to be a matter for the church, guided by prayer, discerned as the will of God by the clergy and people of Rome. What Alberic arranged was not an election, it was an inheritance, dressed carefully in the clothing of an election, so that it might pass. And the men who swore that day did so not because they believed it was right. They swore because Alberic, even dying, even with his voice failing, was still the most powerful man any of them had ever known, and because crossing his family remained dangerous long after he was gone. There is something almost touching, in a grim way, about a dying man going to such lengths for his child. Alberic was not arranging a comfortable life for his son, he was arranging an almost impossible burden. But in his own mind, this was the greatest gift he had to give. He was handing the boy the whole of Rome, sacred and secular, prince and pope united in one pair of hands, a position no one had ever quite held before. He believed he was making his son untouchable. In truth, he was arranging a fall that no amount of family power could prevent. But that fall lay years ahead, and from a deathbed, a man sees only the problem in front of him. Alberic could see only the answer to the question that had troubled his last years, the question of what comes after. Alberic died, and the first part of his plan unfolded so smoothly that it must have seemed for a while like proof that he had been right about everything. Octavian, still a teenager, succeeded his father as Prince of the Romans without opposition. The oath held. The nobles, for the moment, kept their word. The young man took up the secular authority his father had wielded, the command of the city, the running of its administration, the management of its defences. For a brief season, Rome had a teenage prince, and yet no crisis, because the machinery Alberic had built was still turning under its own weight, and the memory of him was still fresh enough to keep ambitious men quiet in their towers. Then, in the autumn of the following year, 955, Pope Agapetus II died. The papal throne fell vacant, and the second half of the oath came due. The clergy and nobles of Rome gathered, and in keeping with the promise they had made over the apostles' tomb, they elected the young Prince Octavian as the next Bishop of Rome, the next successor of St. Peter. He was around 18 years old. By most reckonings, this made him the youngest pope in the entire history of the Church, a record never broken in the way some claim, though there is at least one possible rival for the title in a later century. The exact age is debated and probably always will be, but no one disputes that he was extraordinarily, almost shockingly young for the office. On the 16th of December 955, the teenage prince became the pope. And here we come to a small detail that tells us a great deal about the man and the moment. Octavian did not keep his own name. He took a new one, a papal name, and became Pope John XII. This was only the third time in the entire history of the papacy that a man had changed his name upon election. The first two had done so centuries earlier. By choosing to do it, Octavian was following a rare and deliberate custom, marking the transformation from the man he had been into the office he now held. But the transformation was only ever partial, and this is perhaps the single most revealing fact of his whole reign. He kept both identities running side by side, like two rivers that never quite meet. When he acted as the spiritual head of the Church, when he issued documents concerning religious matters, he signed himself John the Pope. When he acted as the secular ruler of Rome, when he dealt with the practical business of the city, he used his birth name. Octavian, the Prince. Two names, two roles, two selves, and he never fully chose between them. The clerks who served in his administration must have needed a steady hand and a very clear head to keep track of which master they were writing for on any given morning, dipping the pen and pausing before the signature line, deciding which of the two men would sign this one. The boy raised to be both prince and priest had become exactly that, and the deep tension at the centre of his life was now stamped onto every document that left his court. So now we have him, a young man of around 18, seated on the throne of St. Peter, holding in his single person both the spiritual authority of the papacy and the worldly authority of the Roman state. It is worth stopping here, calmly and without judgment, to imagine what that must actually have been like, because the situation was so unusual that it has almost no parallel in history. Most popes, then and now, came to the office late in life, after decades of service. They had spent years as priests, as bishops, as administrators. They had grown old inside the institution, absorbing its traditions, its caution, its particular sense of weight. By the time they reached the throne, they were finished men in the best sense of that phrase. Fully formed. Their characters settled long ago, like sediment at the bottom of still water. John XII was the opposite of all this. He came to the office not at the end of a long career, but at the very beginning of his adult life. He had earned none of it. He had simply inherited it, the way a young king inherits a crown, except that the papacy was never meant to be inherited at all. Think of what that does to a person. An 18-year-old, by nature, is still discovering who he is. He is impulsive, hungry for experience, and certain of his own judgment, in exactly the way that only the inexperienced can be. Give such a young man real and nearly unlimited power, with no one above him to correct him and no long training to restrain him, and you have created something genuinely dangerous. Not because the young man is wicked, because he has been handed something no one that age is equipped to carry. John XII was not a monster placed upon a throne. He was a boy placed upon a throne built for elders, and a great deal of what followed flowed naturally, almost gently, from that single mismatch. In his first months, it should be said, the young pope did in fact perform the ordinary duties of the office, and he performed them competently. The records show him doing precisely the sort of administrative church business that any pope of the period would have done. He confirmed the rights and possessions of monasteries. He granted privileges to bishops and archbishops in distant lands. He sent out the symbolic woolen band called the pallium, the mark of an archbishop's authority, to senior churchmen across Europe. He wrote to a papal representative in the German lands, urging him to condemn the immoral and to defend the church against those who attacked it, which carries a certain quiet irony, given what the chroniclers would later say about the man holding the pen. In one early act, he confirmed the holdings of a famous monastery in the hills outside Rome, attaching to the grant a charming and very 10th century condition. The monks were to recite a particular prayer for mercy a set number of times, 100 repetitions across 3 days each week, a kind of spiritual rent paid on the privilege he was granting them. It is a small detail, but it shows us that the machinery of the papacy kept turning beneath the young pope, that documents were drafted and sealed and sent, that the ordinary work of the church went on in its quiet way, in rooms far from the feasting, while a teenager's name was written at the bottom of the page. But the deeper problem could not be papered over with routine paperwork. The fusion of prince and pope that his father had engineered created a contradiction at the very centre of his life, and no amount of competent administration could dissolve it. As pope, he was supposed to be a figure of moral authority, the spiritual father of all Western Christians, a man whose ordinary daily life set an example that others might follow. As prince, he was the ruler of a turbulent city, surrounded by the temptations and the rough realities of secular power, expected to be hard and worldly and shrewd, because a soft prince in 10th century Rome did not last a winter. These two roles pulled in opposite directions. A far older and wiser man than John might have struggled to hold them together. A teenager raised to expect pleasure and obedience had almost no hope of it. The chroniclers tell us that, freed from the firm hand of his father and answerable now to no one at all, the young pope's princely appetites simply overwhelmed his priestly duties. The palace of the Lateran, the official residence of the popes, became, in the words of his enemies, a place of feasting and gambling and hunting, and worse. The serious-minded clergy of the wider church looked on with a growing unease that turned slowly into alarm. Reports spread beyond Rome, carried on the roads by travellers and pilgrims and ambassadors, that the Holy Office had fallen into the hands of a frivolous and dissolute youth. We must be honest about our sources here, because this matters enormously for any fair judgment of the man. Much of what we know about the private life of John XII comes from a single hostile writer, a northern bishop and diplomat named Liutprand of Cremona, a man with a sharp pen, a gift for the memorable phrase, and a very clear political agenda. Liutprand was loyal to the German king who would later clash with John and destroy him, and he had every reason in the world to paint the Pope in the darkest colours available. His accounts are vivid, detailed, and shocking. They are also exactly the kind of writing a clever enemy would produce. Some of what he says is probably true, some of it is probably exaggerated, some of it may simply have been invented at a desk, late, by a man who knew what his patron wished to read. The careful listener holds all of this in mind and resists the very natural temptation to repeat the worst stories as plain fact, simply because they are the most entertaining. What we can say with confidence is this: a very young man, raised without discipline, was given supreme power and used it, at least in part, to please himself rather than to serve. That much is almost certainly true, and it would be enough on its own to explain the storm that was gathering. He was sowing trouble. Not through any grand wickedness, but through the simple human failure to be equal to an office that no one his age could have filled. And while he feasted and hunted, the world beyond Rome was shifting in ways that would soon reach into his comfortable palace and turn his whole life over. Before we follow him into those troubles, let us pause here. Let us step out of the palace altogether and walk in our imagination through the Rome of his day and meet the ordinary people who filled it. Because a story about a ruler is only half a story unless we can picture the world he ruled. This is the one moment in our journey tonight where we will slow down completely and simply look around us. The first thing to understand is that the Rome of John XII was not a great city in the way it had once been. At the height of the ancient empire, perhaps 1 million people had lived within these walls. By the 10th century, that number had collapsed to something in the region of 30,000. A small town rattling around inside fortifications built for a giant. The people lived among the ruins of their ancestors, and they did so quite literally. Families built their homes into the shells of ancient buildings, in the arches of old theatres, against the walls of crumbling temples, sharing their evenings with columns that had watched emperors pass. Cattle and goats grazed in the open spaces where senators had once argued about the fate of provinces. The Great Forum, once the political heart of the world, had become a field, known to later Romans simply as the cow pasture. People drew their water from the handful of ancient channels that still ran, the last working veins of a vast, dead system. They buried their dead beside churches built from stones quarried out of the monuments around them, so that the same block of travertine might hold up a temple, then a wall, then a tomb. At the top of this small society stood the great families, the aristocracy from which John himself came. These were the people who lived in the fortified towers that had begun to rise across the city, tall stone structures serving as both home and stronghold, from which a family could dominate its own neighbourhood and defend itself against the family in the next street. They dressed to mark their station. Tunics of fine wool, sometimes dyed in rich colours that were expensive and therefore prestigious. Deep reds, blues, greens that announced wealth to anyone who glanced up. Over these they wore cloaks, often lined with fur against the damp Roman winter, fastened at the shoulder with brooches of worked metal. The wealthiest displayed gold and gems, rings and ornaments, and their women wore long gowns and veils and jewellery handed down through generations. To be noble was, in part, simply to be visibly and expensively clothed, in a world where most people wore the same rough cloth for their entire lives. Below the nobles came the clergy, who formed a class of their own and overlapped with every other. The senior clergy, the bishops and cardinals and abbots, often came from noble families and shared their comforts entirely. They wore the distinctive garments of their office, and the highest among them wore that woolen band marked with crosses that signified the rank of archbishop. The lower clergy, the ordinary priests of the city's many small churches, lived far more modestly, close to the level of the people they served, and ate what those people ate. Then came the broad middle of the city, the merchants and artisans and tradespeople who kept Rome functioning day by day, whose names appear nowhere in any chronicle, the bakers and the butchers, the smiths, whose hammering carried across the quiet districts in the early morning, the weavers, the boatmen who worked the slow brown river, and the masons who, with a certain irony that the age itself never noticed, often made their living by pulling down ancient buildings to sell the stone and the iron clamps that had held those stones together for 800 years. They wore simpler tunics of undyed wool or plainly dyed linen, practical clothing for working days, and they lived in modest houses crowded into the inhabited districts near the water, where the shrunken population had gathered together for company and for trade. And at the bottom were the poor, the labourers, the servants, the beggars, who made up a very large share of the city. They wore the coarsest cloth, often one single garment worn until it fell apart on the body. They lived hand to mouth, dependent on work when work could be found, and on charity when it could not. For them the church was not only a spiritual institution, it was a lifeline, the source of the bread and the alms that stood between a family and starvation in a hard year, and there were many hard years. And what did all these people eat? The foundation of the Roman diet, as of nearly every diet in medieval Europe, was bread. Bread was life. The price of grain was the single most important fact in any ordinary person's existence, more important than any pope, more important than any emperor. Alongside the bread came a thick porridge of grains and beans, the everyday food of the poor, simple and filling and warm in the hands on a cold morning. Beans and lentils and other legumes were eaten everywhere. Cheese and eggs added what protein they could. Olive oil, that Mediterranean constant, enriched and flavoured almost everything. And wine was drunk by everyone, rich and poor alike, though the quality varied enormously, because the water was not always safe, and wine was both nourishment and pleasure at once. The wealthy, of course, ate far better. Their tables held meat, which the poor saw rarely, pork above all, along with poultry, and for the nobility the prized flesh of wild game brought back from the hunts in the countryside, the very hunts that the young Pope loved so much. Fish from the river and from the sea nearby appeared often, especially on the many days when the church forbade the eating of meat. There were chestnuts and almonds, figs and grapes, honey for sweetness in a world that had never tasted sugar, and spices for those who could afford the long trade routes that carried them across the world in small quantities at enormous cost. A noble feast in 10th century Rome would have been a generous and varied affair, loud with talk, warm with fires, and in the same city, on the same evening, a poor family might be quietly grateful for bread and beans and a little oil. This, then, was the human world over which John XII presided. A small, dense, layered society living among the bones of a vanished empire, eating its bread, drinking its wine, working and praying and scheming in the shadow of the ruins. A world that asked very little of its rulers beyond order, food and protection, and asked a great deal of its poor. And into the comfortable upper layer of that world, where the young Pope feasted on game and wore the finest wool, trouble was about to arrive. First along the road from the south, and soon after from over the mountains in the north. Now we must turn to the most famous and the most difficult part of his story, the part that made his name a byword for scandal for 1,000 years. We must walk into the Lateran Palace and look honestly at the reputation he earned there. And we must do it carefully, because this is exactly the place where legend and fact are hardest to pull apart. The accusations against the young Pope are remarkable in both their range and their boldness. According to the hostile accounts, and above all according to Liutprand, John XII turned the sacred palace of the popes into something closer to a pleasure house. He was said to spend his days hunting and his nights feasting and gambling. He was accused of keeping company with women of every kind, of conducting open affairs, of fathering children. He was charged with handing out church offices in exchange for money or favours, the sin the church called simony, and considered among the gravest a churchman could commit. He was said to ordain men to holy orders in wholly inappropriate places, and for wholly inappropriate reasons, including, in one notorious claim, ordaining a deacon in a stable, among the straw and the animals. And he was accused of stranger things still, of violence against those who displeased him, of raising his cup and toasting the devil over his wine, of calling on the old pagan gods of Rome while throwing dice, invoking Jupiter and Venus over a gambling table. Even by the relaxed standards of 10th century Rome, that last was considered a step too far. How much of this is true? The honest answer is that we cannot fully know, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling a certainty they do not possess. The core problem, as we have already seen, is that nearly all of these stories come from enemies, and from one enemy in particular who wrote with a very clear purpose. Ludeprand of Cremona was a brilliant and entertaining writer, genuinely one of the finest of his century. He was also a partisan, a man serving the interests of the German king who would soon destroy John. When such a writer tells us that a pope did monstrous things, we are right to read him with one eyebrow gently raised. Propaganda works, after all, precisely by mixing real failings with invented ones, so that the believable parts lend their credibility to the unbelievable. And yet we should not swing too far the other way and dismiss it all as invention. There are real reasons to think the basic picture has some truth in it. The accusations were made openly, in public, at a church council, by Roman clergy who had known the Pope personally, men who had stood in the same rooms with him. They were detailed and specific rather than vague. And even the defenders of the papacy in later centuries, men who had every possible reason to protect the reputation of the office, admitted that John XII fell far short of what a pope should be. When even your friends concede that you were a disgrace, the charge becomes difficult to wave away entirely. The most reasonable conclusion is a quiet middle one. The young pope did live a worldly and undisciplined life. He indulged his appetites in ways that genuinely scandalized serious Christians, and his enemies then took those real failings and embroidered them into the lurid tapestry we have inherited, thread by thread, until it was far more vivid than the truth had ever been. But it is worth asking why these stories took hold so powerfully, and the answer tells us something important about the age itself. The 10th century was a time when many thoughtful Christians were deeply troubled by the state of the Church. The reforming movement that John's own father had supported, the long effort to restore discipline and holiness to monasteries and clergy, was gathering strength across Europe, spreading from house to house like a slow fire. To these reformers, a pope who lived like a dissolute prince was not merely a personal embarrassment. He was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong, the rot at the very top, the proof that the Church had been captured by worldly power and needed urgently to be set free. John XII became for them the perfect illustration of the disease they wished to cure. His scandal served a purpose inside a much larger argument, and that is part of why the stories were remembered and repeated with such energy for so long. A man can be turned into an example, and once he has been, the example matters more than the man. We should also remember the human reality underneath the legend. Here was a young man handed the most sacred office in the West, not because of any holiness or any calling, but because his father had forced a city to swear an oath over the tomb of an apostle. He had not chosen the priesthood. He had never felt a vocation, never known that quiet inward turning that draws a person toward God. He had been a prince first, and a churchman only by political design. Is it really so surprising that such a young man, raised to expect every pleasure, trained for power rather than for prayer, lived as a prince rather than as a saint? Once the restraining hand of his father was gone, his failings were not the strange wickedness of a villain. They were the ordinary failings of a privileged and undisciplined youth, magnified to enormous scale by the extraordinary office he happened to hold. There is a kind of sadness in it when you sit with it long enough. John XII seems never to have wanted to be a holy man, and no one ever thought to ask him whether he did. He wanted to ride and hunt and feast and command. The things he had been raised from infancy to enjoy. And through an accident of birth and his father's ambition, he was placed in a position where those very desires became a public scandal echoing across Christendom. He was, in a sense, the wrong man in the wrong job, put there by someone else, and then blamed for being exactly who he had always been. But while the chroniclers were busy cataloguing his sins, John was not only feasting, he was also, like his father before him, a ruler with ambitions, a prince who wanted to expand his power and recover lands he believed belonged to the papacy. And it was this side of him, the prince rather than the pleasure-seeker, that led him into the first great miscalculation of his reign. For the young pope, it turned out, fancied himself not only a lord of feasts, but a leader of armies. And the battlefield, unlike the banquet hall, does not forgive inexperience. It is easy, given the scandals, to imagine him as nothing more than an idle young man lounging in his palace, while the church decayed around him. But that picture is incomplete, and the incompleteness hides something real about him. The young pope was his father's son. He had inherited Alberic's appetite for power and territory, even if he had inherited none of his skill in handling it. John did not want merely to enjoy Rome. He wanted to enlarge the lands and the influence of the papacy. He wanted to be a great prince as well as a pope. And so, a few years into his reign, he did something that surprised many people, and probably surprised him most of all by how badly it went. He went to war. The target of his ambition lay to the south. There, in the regions of southern Italy, sat a patchwork of Lombard duchies, semi-independent states ruled by their own dukes, including the duchies centred on the cities of Benevento and Capua. John believed, with some genuine historical justification, that certain lands held by these dukes had once belonged to the papacy and ought now to be recovered. Around the year 960, he resolved to take them back by force. He gathered an army, drawing fighting men from Rome itself and from the surrounding territories of central Italy, and he marched south to assert his claim. Imagine the sound of it. Horses on the old roads, dust rising in the heat. A young man at the head of a column, in armour rather than vestments, riding out of the city that had never once told him no. There is something almost endearing in the boldness of it. John had been raised to ride and to hunt, not to command armies in the field. He had no military training worth the name, no experience of campaigns, no record of leadership in war of any kind. And yet he persuaded enough men to follow him that he was able to put a real force on the road and march it into the lands of the southern dukes. For a young man with no business leading an army, simply assembling one was no small achievement. The trouble, of course, came when the campaign actually had to be fought. The southern dukes were not impressed, and they were not foolish. Faced with the Pope's army, the dukes of Benevento and Capua did not rush to meet him in open battle, where the outcome would be uncertain, and where a single bad hour could cost a man everything he owned. Instead, they did the sensible thing. They called for help. They appealed to a more powerful neighbour, the Prince of Salerno, a capable lord named Gisulf, and asked him to join them against the invader from the north. And here the whole enterprise quietly unravelled. When word reached John's army that the Prince of Salerno had agreed to enter the war against them, the will to fight simply drained away. The Pope and his men, suddenly facing a coalition far stronger than anything they had bargained for, turned around and marched home to their own territories. The grand campaign to recover the lost lands of the papacy ended not in a glorious battle, but in a quiet retreat, at nothing more than the news that a serious opponent had joined the field. No clash of shields, no banners in the dust, only a column of men walking back the way they had come, the sound of hooves on the same road, going the other direction. It was a humbling result, and it revealed, with painful clarity, the gap between John's ambitions and his abilities. He had the desire for conquest, but none of the craft. He could raise an army, but he could not lead it to victory. And like many a young man who has overreached and been embarrassed, he then tried to repair the damage through diplomacy. He reached out to the very Prince of Salerno who had frightened off his army and proposed an alliance. The prince, a shrewd operator who understood exactly what he was being offered and by whom, agreed to a treaty. The exact terms were never made public, which tells us, in its own quiet way, that John probably had to give away a good deal more than he gained in order to save face. The young pope had learned the hard way that ambition without competence leads only to expensive lessons. This failed war matters for our story in two ways. First, it shows us that John XII was not simply a lazy hedonist. He was an active and ambitious ruler who genuinely tried to extend his power and who failed, not for lack of effort, but for lack of skill and resources. He wanted to be a great prince, and he kept reaching for greatness, even when his reach fell far short of his grasp. Second, and far more importantly, the episode exposed how weak his position truly was. A pope who could not subdue a pair of southern dukes, who had to retreat at the mere approach of a single regional prince, was not a man who could defend himself against a serious threat. And a serious threat was now taking shape, not in the south where he had been adventuring, but in the north of Italy. The lesson he should have drawn from that southern failure was caution, an awareness of his own limits, a recognition that he could not stand alone against powerful enemies. Whether he drew that lesson or not, events were about to force the conclusion upon him. For while he had been marching pointlessly south and then negotiating his way back out of trouble, a king in the north of Italy had been steadily building his own power, and that king's gaze was turning toward Rome. The threat that now loomed bore the name of Berengar, the second man of that name to claim the crown of Italy. To understand the danger he posed, we have to understand the broken political landscape of the Italian peninsula in this century, because it was a landscape almost designed to produce ambitious, predatory rulers like him. After the collapse of the great empire that the Frankish king Charlemagne had built a century and a half earlier, Italy had fractured into competing pieces. There was a title, the Crown of Italy, the kingship of the old Lombard lands in the north, and there was a long and bloody contest among rival nobles to seize and hold it. The crown passed from one claimant to another in a dizzying succession of coups and betrayals and short, violent reigns. It was a prize that brought prestige and almost no security, because whoever held it was immediately surrounded by men calculating how to take it away. Berengar II was the latest man to grasp that dangerous crown, and he held it with the nervous ferocity of someone who knew precisely how easily it could be lost. He was an able and ruthless ruler, exactly the kind of man the chaos of Italy tended to throw up. He had clawed his way to the throne, and he intended to extend his power as far as it would reach. His ambitions turned naturally southward, towards central Italy, toward the rich and prestigious territories controlled by the papacy, toward Rome itself. To a hard-headed northern king, the lands of the church looked like a tempting prize, and the young, inexperienced pope who ruled them looked like an easy target. Berengar began to press on the papal territories, threatening the lands and the independence that John XII was supposed to defend. For John, this was a nightmare taking shape by degrees. He had already demonstrated, in his failed southern campaign, that he could not stand up to even modest military opposition. Now he faced a determined and capable king, a man who held the crown of Italy, who commanded real armies, and who wanted what John had. There was no realistic hope of defeating him in the field. John's own forces were too weak, his own skills too limited, and his recent humiliation in the south had proved both to anyone who was paying attention. He was a cornered man, ruling a city and a territory he could not defend, facing an enemy he could not beat. And this is where the deep structural weakness of his position became impossible to ignore. The papacy of the 10th century, for all its spiritual prestige, was a fragile thing as a worldly power. It controlled lands but struggled to hold them. It commanded reverence but not reliable armies. When a serious military predator appeared on the horizon, the Pope had no good answer from within his own resources. The Roman nobility, the great families like John's own, were as much a source of instability as of strength, always ready to pursue their own interests the moment those interests diverged. There was no standing papal army strong enough to face down a king. In a hard military crisis, the Pope was very nearly helpless on his own. But John's predecessors had faced versions of this same problem, and they had found one traditional solution. When a pope could not defend himself, he called for a protector, a powerful Christian ruler from beyond Italy who might be persuaded to march to the rescue in exchange for prestige, legitimacy, and the gratitude of the Church. For centuries, the great protectors of the papacy had been the Frankish kings, and above all, Charlemagne, who had come to the aid of a pope in trouble and had been crowned emperor in return, founding a partnership between the papacy and a northern champion that shaped the whole early medieval world. That empire had long since crumbled. The imperial title itself had fallen into disuse, claimed by no one for many years, a crown lying somewhere in the dark of history with no head beneath it. But the memory of it remained. The memory of a time when a strong king from the north had ridden down to Rome's defence and been rewarded with the highest crown in Christendom. As Berengar's pressure mounted and his own weakness became undeniable, John XII began to look northward, beyond the Alps, toward the German lands where a new power had risen. There, a king named Otto had been steadily building a realm stronger and more orderly than anything Italy could produce. He had united the German duchies beneath his firm hand. He had won great victories, including a famous and decisive battle against the fearsome Magyar horsemen who had terrorized Europe for generations, riding out of the east and vanishing again before anyone could gather to meet them. That victory had ended their threat for good, and had made Otto's name ring across the continent as a defender of Christendom. He was, by any measure, the most powerful ruler in the Western world. A king who looked very much like the protector the papacy had always turned to in its hour of need. For John, the logic was painfully clear, even if the consequences were not. He could not defeat Berengar alone. He needed a champion, and the obvious champion, the strongest sword in Christendom, sat on a throne beyond the mountains. There was an obvious price such a king would want in return, the same price the great protectors of the past had received. John could offer the imperial crown, dormant for so long, the title of emperor, to be revived and placed on Otto's head by the hands of the Pope himself. It was a momentous thing to offer, and a dangerous one, because a man crowned emperor by a pope might well decide that he, and not the Pope, was now the true master of Rome. But a cornered man does not have the luxury of caution. John needed help, and there was only one place in the world to find it. He resolved to send for Otto, a letter going north, over the passes, into the cold. That decision was the single most consequential act of his life, and very possibly one of the most consequential acts of any pope in the entire medieval period. It is worth slowing down here, because the young pope, reaching for a quick solution to an immediate problem, set in motion a chain of events whose effects would last the better part of 1,000 years. The man he summoned was no ordinary king. Otto, called the Great by later generations, was ruler of the East Frankish lands, the kingdom we can loosely think of as the beginning of Germany. He had inherited a realm of fractious, semi-independent duchies, and through a combination of force, patience, and political skill, he had welded them into the strongest single power in Europe. He had crushed rebellions among his own nobles, including within his own family. He had extended his authority over neighbouring peoples, and in his greatest hour, he had led a Christian army to a crushing victory over those Magyar horsemen whose raids had spread terror across the continent for half a century. That victory had ended the danger permanently, and had clothed Otto in the prestige of a saviour of Christendom. He was exactly the kind of mighty, devout, and ambitious ruler to whom a desperate pope would turn. And Otto, for his part, had reasons of his own to be interested in Italy. This is crucial to understanding why he answered so readily. He had already intervened in Italian affairs once before, years earlier. He had even taken as his wife a remarkable woman named Adelaide, widow of a previous Italian king, whom Berengar had imprisoned, and who had escaped in a flight so dramatic that it became famous across Europe within her own lifetime. Through that marriage, Otto held a personal stake in the Italian crown and a personal grievance against Berengar. Some debts are political, and some are older and quieter than that. More than this, Otto was a man of soaring ambition. The imperial title, the crown of the Roman emperors, unclaimed for decades, called to him. He saw himself as the heir of Charlemagne, the natural champion of the Church, the rightful restorer of the empire in the West. So when the Pope's appeal arrived, it did not fall upon reluctant ears. It offered Otto precisely what he most wanted, an invitation to come to Rome and be crowned emperor by the successor of St. Peter. The negotiations carried a sharp edge, as such negotiations always do beneath their courtesies. John's envoys travelled north to put the proposal before the German king, and the message they carried amounted to this. The Pope needed protection against Berengar, and in return he would crown Otto emperor. There was even a hard point of bargaining. Otto had already been granted a senior Roman rank, and the envoys reportedly pressed him with a choice. Either come to Rome and earn the imperial crown by defending the Pope, or surrender the dignity he had been given. It was the language of a transaction, a deal between two rulers, each of whom needed something only the other could supply. John needed military protection. Otto needed the legitimacy that only the Pope could bestow. Each held exactly what the other lacked. And so the bargain was struck, and Otto prepared to march. At the very end of January, in the year 962, the German king crossed into Italy at the head of his army and moved south toward Rome. Berengar, the threat that had driven John to this desperate measure, was in no position whatsoever to stop the most powerful army in Europe. The arrival of Otto changed everything in an instant. The young Pope, who days before had been a cornered ruler facing an enemy he could not beat, suddenly had the strongest king in Christendom marching to his rescue. It must have felt to John like deliverance, but a wiser or more experienced man might have felt something cold moving beneath the relief. There is an old danger in calling a powerful protector into your house. The protector may decide that he likes your house. He may be slow to leave it. John was inviting into Rome a man far stronger than himself, a man with his own ambitions, his own sense of destiny, and his own firm ideas about who should truly hold authority in that city and in that church. By placing the imperial crown on Otto's head, John would be creating a partner who could very quickly become a master. The Pope was about to make an emperor, and an emperor, by ancient understanding, was a figure of supreme worldly authority, the protector and overseer of Christendom, including, in some sense that no one had yet needed to define precisely, the protector and overseer of the Pope himself. John, it seems, did not think this far ahead. Or perhaps he thought he could manage the relationship, that he could take Otto's protection and grant Otto's crown and still keep the upper hand in his own city, among his own people, on his own streets. It was the same overconfidence that had sent him marching south against the dukes, the certainty of a young man who has never truly been beaten and cannot quite imagine that he might be. He saw a solution to his immediate problem, and he took it without fully reckoning the cost. The cost would come due soon enough, but for the moment, all was triumph. The German king was coming, Berengar was checked, and a great ceremony was being prepared in the most sacred church in the West. On the 2nd of February in the year 962, in the great basilica of St. Peter in Rome, Pope John XII placed the imperial crown upon the head of Otto, King of the Germans, and proclaimed him emperor. Beside him, his wife Adelaide was crowned empress. Let the picture settle for a moment. The winter light coming thin through high windows, incense hanging in the cold air, hundreds of people standing very still. A young man of about 24, lifting a crown with both hands, in a building raised over the tomb of an apostle. With that act, the imperial title that had lain dormant for decades was revived in the West, and a new chapter of European history began. It is hard to overstate the significance of what happened in the basilica that day, even though the man performing the ceremony probably understood it mostly as a clever political arrangement, a payment made in advance for services soon to be rendered. The coronation of Otto created what would later be called the Holy Roman Empire, a political entity that would endure, in one form or another, until it was finally abolished more than 800 years later, in a world of gunpowder and printing presses, and nations that had not yet been imagined. The partnership forged that day between the German monarchy and the imperial title bestowed by the Pope became one of the central facts of European political life for the whole medieval period and long beyond it. From that moment onward, the kings of the German lands would claim the imperial dignity. They would see themselves as protectors of the Church and heirs of the ancient Roman emperors. And they would be drawn again and again, generation after generation, across the Alps into the affairs of Italy and of the papacy. For John XII, the coronation was meant to be a transaction and nothing more. Otto would defend the Pope against Berengar and the other threats of Italy, and in exchange, the Pope would give Otto the supreme worldly honour that only the papacy could confer. On the surface, both men received exactly what they wanted. Otto received the imperial crown, the fulfilment of his deepest ambition and the legitimation of everything he had built. John received the protection of the most formidable ruler in Christendom. It looked, in that February ceremony, like a perfect bargain, sealed with all the solemnity the Church could summon. But beneath the surface, the coronation contained a contradiction that would soon tear the partnership apart. And it is worth understanding clearly because it explains everything that follows. The trouble was a simple question of authority. By crowning Otto emperor, John had elevated him to a position that, in the eyes of the age, carried tremendous responsibility for the well-being of the Church and the city of Rome. An emperor was not merely a king who happened to hold a grander title. He was understood to be a kind of supreme protector and overseer of Western Christians, a figure with both the right and the duty to ensure that the Church was governed justly and that the Pope himself behaved properly. In creating an emperor, John had, without quite intending it, created a man who might claim authority over the Pope. And Otto was not a man to wear an empty title. He took his new imperial role with deadly seriousness, as he took everything. He had his own firm ideas about how the Church should be run and how the city of Rome should be ordered. He was a genuine reformer, a king who had spent his reign appointing capable and pious bishops in his own lands, using the Church as a pillar of orderly government rather than as a source of private profit. The reputation of the young Pope who had just crowned him would not have escaped his notice, nor would it have pleased a man of his temperament. Otto looked at Rome and at its Pope, and he saw disorder where he believed there ought to be discipline. He had not crossed the Alps merely to preserve the existing arrangement. In his own mind, he had come to set things right. There was also a hard, practical instrument attached to all of this. As part of the settlement around the coronation, agreements were made concerning the rights of the papacy and the relationship between Pope and Emperor. Otto issued a document confirming the territories and privileges of the Church, a generous-seeming grant on its face. But woven into the new arrangement was the expectation of obedience, the understanding that the Pope and the Romans owed loyalty to the Emperor, that they would not aid his enemies, and that the Emperor now stood as guardian of the proper ordering of Rome. The protector had become an overseer. The champion John had summoned to save him from Berengar now claimed a supervisory role over John himself. We can imagine, though the sources never record his private thoughts, how this must have begun to sit with the young Pope, as the meaning of what he had done slowly sank in. Perhaps it came to him at night, in the way such realizations tend to arrive. He had wanted a sword to wield against his enemy. He had acquired a master instead. Otto did defeat Berengar. He did secure the papal lands. He did fulfill his side of the bargain in the immediate military sense, entirely and efficiently. But the price was the arrival in Italy of a power greater than the papacy, a power that now considered itself entitled to judge and to correct the Pope. For a young man raised to command, who had answered to no one at all since his father's death, this was intolerable. He had traded one threat for another, and the new one sat far closer to home, wearing a crown that his own hands had placed there. It did not take long for the resentment to harden into action. Otto, having settled affairs as best he could, and trusting that the young Pope would now behave himself, turned to deal with the lingering problem of Berengar and the wider business of his new empire, and he left Rome to pursue these tasks. The moment the emperor's back was turned, John XII began to do something that, in hindsight, looks almost suicidally reckless. He began to plot against the very man he had just crowned. The arrangement between Pope and Emperor had been formalized in a famous document, an imperial privilege confirming the rights and lands of the Church. On paper, it looked like a great gift to the papacy. Otto solemnly confirmed the territories the popes claimed, guaranteed certain freedoms, and presented himself as the protector of the Church's possessions. A pope reading it might have seen a charter of security, a powerful emperor pledging to defend the wealth and lands of St. Peter for all time. But John did not read it that way for long, because beneath the generous confirmations lay the hard kernel he could not swallow. The new order made plain that the emperor expected loyalty, that the Pope and the Romans were bound to him, that Otto now stood as the supervising power over the right ordering of Rome and its Church. To a young man who had ruled his city as an absolute prince, who had been raised to command and had never in his adult life answered to a superior, this was unbearable. He had summoned Otto to be his shield. He had not meant to acquire a supervisor who could call him to account like a badly behaved child. The very document that secured the papacy's lands also secured the papacy's subordination to a greater power, and John was not willing to accept the second in exchange for the first. The speed of the betrayal is genuinely startling. He had crowned Otto emperor in February. By the later part of that same year and into the next, he was actively conspiring to undo what he had done, to drive his new protector out of Italy and recover his own independence. The mind that conceived this plan was reckless to the point of folly, but it was also, in its way, the mind of a true son of Alberic, a man who could not abide a master in his own city, and who reached instinctively for intrigue when force lay beyond him. The shape of the conspiracy reveals just how far he was willing to go. The most extraordinary part of it was that he opened secret communications with the family of the very enemy from whom Otto had just delivered him. Berengar, the King of Italy, whose threats had driven John to summon Otto in the first place, had a son named Adalbert, and it was to this Adalbert, the heir of his recent enemy, that John now turned. The Pope, who had called in a German emperor to crush Berengar, was now plotting with Berengar's own son to drive that emperor back out of Italy. The reversal is almost dizzying to follow. It shows a man flailing for any ally at all who might help him recover his freedom, however unlikely, however dangerous, however completely it contradicted everything he had done only months before. Nor did he stop there. The accounts suggest he cast his net wider still in his search for allies against Otto, reaching toward other powers who might be enlisted, including, it was said, distant rulers in the east, and even, in the wildest reports, toward the pagan enemies of Christendom whom Otto had spent his career fighting. We should treat the most extreme of these claims with the same caution we have applied throughout, since accusing a pope of consorting with unbelievers was exactly the kind of charge designed to blacken a name beyond any recovery. But the central fact is not seriously in doubt. John XII, having crowned Otto emperor, turned against him and tried to organize his overthrow, and he was willing to ally with almost anyone, including the son of his old enemy, in order to do it. What was the young pope thinking? It is tempting to call it simple madness, but there is a logic in it if you look gently. The logic of a proud man who had made a terrible mistake and was desperate to undo it. John had realized, too late, that in summoning Otto he had not solved his problem. He had replaced it with a worse one. The threat of Berengar had been the threat of losing some lands and some independence. The reality of Otto was the threat of losing his autonomy altogether, of becoming a subordinate figure in his own city, watched and judged and corrected by an emperor of his own making. To a man of John's temperament, raised to absolute command, the second prospect was far worse than the first. And so he reasoned, perhaps, that if he could only be rid of Otto, everything might return to what it had been. An independent pope ruling an independent Rome, even if the price was dealing once more with Berengar's family. It was a catastrophic miscalculation, and it rested on a fatal underestimation of the man he was betraying. Otto the Great had not clawed his way to the mastery of Europe by tolerating treachery. He was hard, capable, and unforgiving. and he had powerful friends inside Rome itself, clergy and nobles who were appalled by John's conduct and who kept the emperor carefully informed of the Pope's intrigues. Word reached Otto, and the emperor turned his attention back toward Rome with cold purpose. The young Pope had poped the most dangerous man in the Western world, and that man was now coming back to deal with him. John, who had once cornered himself against Berengar, had now cornered himself against a far greater power, and this time there would be no escape by calling for a champion, because the champion was the very enemy bearing down upon him. When Otto learned that the Pope he had crowned was plotting against him, he did not respond with rage or with reckless violence. He responded as the careful, methodical ruler he had always been. He turned back toward Rome with his army, and he prepared to deal with John through a combination of military pressure and legal process. The emperor understood that simply attacking a pope would be a scandal of its own kind and would follow him for the rest of his life. He wanted not merely to defeat John, but to discredit him, to remove him from the papal throne through a procedure carrying the weight of the Church's own authority, so that no one could say afterward that it had been done by force alone. And so Otto reached for an instrument rarely used against a sitting pope: a great church council, a synod that would sit in judgment upon the conduct of the supreme pontiff himself. As the imperial forces approached, John made the choice that desperate rulers so often make. He fled. Rather than stay and face the emperor and the gathering council, he took what he could carry and left the city, retreating to a stronghold in the hills outside Rome, bringing with him, the accounts say, a portion of the papal treasury. It was the act of a man who knew he could not win a confrontation and hoped to wait out the storm from a safe distance, perhaps to return once the emperor had departed again, as emperors always eventually do. But fleeing also meant abandoning the field to his enemies. It meant leaving Rome and the council in Otto's hands, and giving the emperor a clear path to do exactly what he intended. In November of the year 963, the synod convened in the basilica of St. Peter, the same great church where John had crowned Otto less than 2 years before. The same church where, a decade earlier, his dying father had gathered the men of Rome and extracted the oath that made his son a pope. Now that same sacred space became a courtroom. Otto presided. The assembled bishops and clergy, many of them Romans who had known John personally, who had eaten at his table and ridden out with him, were called upon to consider the charges against their absent pope. The proceedings were extraordinary, almost without precedent. Here was the Church in formal council putting the successor of St. Peter on trial for his life and conduct. The charges read out that day are the source of many of the lurid stories that have come down to us, and we should weigh them with the same care we have applied throughout. The clergy testified one after another to the failings of the absent pope. They accused him of ordaining men for money, of elevating a boy to a bishopric, of ordaining a deacon in a stable, of mutilating and harming churchmen who had crossed him, of neglecting the spiritual duties of his office, of celebrating the sacred rites carelessly or not at all, and of a long list of personal immoralities. One of the more striking accusations was that he had so neglected the basic practice of his own faith that he sometimes performed the holy ceremonies without himself receiving the sacrament, and that he had invoked the names of pagan gods over his gambling. The list was long, detailed, and damning, and it was delivered by men who claimed personal knowledge of what they described. We have already discussed why these charges cannot simply be taken as plain, unvarnished fact. They were made in a political proceeding, before a hostile emperor, by witnesses who had every reason to curry favour with the new power in Rome, against an absent man who could not question them or answer a single word. The whole event was designed to justify a removal that had already been decided, and we should expect the accusations to have been shaped accordingly. And yet, as before, the sheer specificity of the testimony and the agreement among men who had known him suggests a real foundation beneath the political embroidery. The fairest reading remains the quiet middle one. John was indeed a worldly and undisciplined pope, whose conduct gave his enemies ample raw material, which they then assembled into the most devastating indictment they could construct. The synod, having heard the charges, summoned the absent pope to appear and answer for himself. Safe in his hilltop refuge, John refused. He sent back a defiant message rather than coming down to face his accusers. And, according to the accounts, he even threatened those conducting the proceedings with spiritual penalties, reaching for the weapons of the papal office, warning that he would excommunicate every one of them if they dared to depose him. It was the response of a man who still believed absolutely in the authority of his position, even as that authority crumbled quietly beneath his feet. But defiance from a distance carries little weight against an emperor and a council holding the city. The synod proceeded without him. On the 4th of December, in the year 963, the council pronounced its judgment. It declared John XII deposed from the papal throne. Removed from the office his father had schemed so hard and died so carefully to secure for him. And in his place, the synod, under Otto's guiding hand, elected a new pope, a man named Leo, who took the name Leo VIII. The choice was itself remarkable and controversial, because Leo was not even a clergyman at the time of his election. He was a layman, a senior official of the Roman administration who had to be rushed through the necessary church ranks in order to be installed. The irregularity would cause a great deal of trouble later, and would give John's supporters solid grounds to argue that both the deposition and the new election had been invalid from the beginning. But for the moment, Otto had what he wanted. The troublesome young pope was declared removed. A compliant new pope sat upon the throne. The emperor appeared to have mastered the situation completely. Appeared to. For John XII was not finished, and the people of Rome had not forgotten whose son he was. The triumph of Otto and his new pope proved far more fragile than it had looked in that December basilica, and the reason reveals something important about the limits of even the greatest power in the 10th century. An emperor with an army could enter Rome, oversee a synod, and impose a new pope. But an emperor could not stay in Rome forever. Otto had a vast realm to govern, enemies to face, responsibilities scattered across a continent. Sooner or later he had to leave, and when he left, he had to leave the imposed pope behind, holding a position that rested almost entirely on strength that was no longer there. That moment came early in the year 964. With affairs seemingly settled and the deposed John apparently neutralized in exile, Otto withdrew the bulk of his forces to attend to other matters. And the instant the emperor's grip relaxed, the true feeling of the city revealed itself. The Romans, it turned out, did not love the pope who had been forced upon them by a foreign emperor. Whatever John's failings, and they knew them well, he was a Roman, the son of the great Alberic, a man of their own city. Leo was Otto's creature, installed by outside power against the ancient right of the Romans to choose their own bishop. The proud citizens resented the interference deeply, and that resentment was a force John could use. Sensing his moment, he moved to recover what he had lost. He had supporters inside the walls who had never accepted his deposition, and with the emperor gone, they could act. The deposed pope and his allies struck, and Leo, suddenly bereft of the imperial troops who had been his only real protection, found he could not hold the city at all. He fled, running for the safety of Otto's court. John XII returned in triumph and reclaimed the throne from which the synod had so recently cast him down. The man declared deposed by a great church council was, within a few short months, back in possession of his office, restored by the will of the Romans and the absence of the emperor. But the John who returned was not in a forgiving mood, and here the darker side of his character, the side his enemies had always emphasized, came fully to the surface. He had been humiliated, deposed, declared a criminal before the whole church. Now he had power again, and a long list of names. The accounts of his vengeance are grim. He moved against those who had taken part in the synod and the proceedings against him, against the clergy and officials who had testified or cooperated in his deposition, and his retribution was savage and physical. He is said to have inflicted brutal mutilations upon those who had crossed him. The hand of one, the nose, or the fingers, or the tongue of another. The bodily punishments that were the harsh currency of medieval vengeance. Whatever sympathy we might extend to a young man trapped by his upbringing evaporates somewhat here, in the face of such cold cruelty toward men who had merely spoken words against him. He also moved to undo the legitimacy of everything done in his absence. He held his own council, which declared the synod invalid and pronounced the election of Leo null and void, on the grounds that a sitting pope could not lawfully be deposed in such a manner, and that Leo's rushed elevation from layman to pontiff had been irregular. And there was, buried in all this, a genuine legal argument. The deposition of a pope by an emperor's synod, against that pope's will, raised real questions about church law and authority that would trouble canon lawyers for centuries afterward. John was not merely lashing out, he was also constructing a case that he had never been legitimately removed at all, that he remained the true pope, and that Leo was a usurper. The argument had real force, and it ensured that the question of who was rightful pope would not be quickly or cleanly resolved. So for a brief season, John XII was restored. Vengeful, defiant, master of Rome once more, having clawed back the throne that the most powerful man in Europe had taken from him. It was a remarkable reversal, a testament to the loyalty he commanded as a son of Rome and to the limits of imperial power so far from the imperial heartland. But it could not last, and he must have known it. Otto, learning that John had returned, that his own pope had been driven out, that the deposed troublemaker was now mutilating the emperor's supporters in the streets, was certain to come back. The emperor's pride and his control over Italy were both at stake, and Otto the Great did not leave such challenges unanswered. The army would return. The reckoning would come again. The only question was what would happen when those forces once more approached the walls, with John inside, defiant and cornered, his enemies all around him, and his protector turned implacable foe. As it happened, that final confrontation never came. Fate, or as the chroniclers preferred to have it, divine judgment, arrived first. The end came suddenly, in the month of May, in the year 964. While he still held Rome, with the great confrontation still unresolved, the young pope who had been a prince and a pontiff, who had crowned an emperor and then plotted his downfall, who had been deposed and had clawed his way back, died abruptly at the age of around 27. His turbulent life ended before he reached the age at which many men of his era were only beginning to come into their own. The circumstances of his death are as murky and as disputed as everything else about him, and the two versions that have come down to us tell us a great deal about how he was remembered. The first, the sober one, holds that he suffered a sudden stroke, a seizure that struck him down, and that he died a few days later. This is entirely plausible. Such deaths were common enough, and there is nothing remarkable in a man, even a young one, being carried off in that way. The second version is the one the chroniclers preferred, and especially his enemies, because it fitted so perfectly the moral lesson they wished to draw. According to that account, John died in the act of adultery, struck down, some said, by a blow from the outraged husband of the woman he was with, or else felled by a seizure in the very midst of his sin. To the moralists of the age, this was the perfect ending. The dissolute pope dying in the middle of the vice that had defined his reign, struck down by God or by an avenging hand at the exact moment of his transgression. It was too neat, too fitting, too useful as a sermon to be accepted without question, and yet we cannot rule it out. His life had given his enemies every reason to believe the worst of him, and the worst is sometimes simply true. The honest position is that we do not know how he died, only that he died young and suddenly, and that the manner of his death became, like everything else about him, a weapon in the long argument over his memory. One detail carries a certain dark resonance. It was said that in his final days he died without receiving the last rites of the Church. The sacraments a dying Christian was meant to receive, to prepare the soul for what came next. For a pope, the supreme dispenser of those very sacraments, to die without them was, to medieval minds, a chilling and significant thing. A sign that even at the end he remained a stranger to the holy office he had never truly inhabited. Whether the detail is true or simply one final moral flourish, it captures the sadness of the man. A pope who lived and died as something other than a pope, who held the sacred office his whole adult life and never once seemed to belong to it. And so he passed from the scene, and the conflict he had set in motion outlived him easily. His death did not settle the dispute, because the question of whether Leo was the rightful pope, or whether the Romans might choose their own bishop free of the emperor's will, remained bitterly contested. The Romans, defiant to the last, elected yet another pope of their own choosing after John's death, and Otto had to return once more, lay siege to the city, and impose his will by force before the matter was finally, for the moment, settled in the emperor's favour. The struggle John had begun between the independence of the papacy and the authority of the emperor who claimed to protect it would echo down the centuries, flaring again and again in the great contests between popes and emperors that shaped the entire medieval world. What, then, are we to make of him, this strange young man at the centre of our story? It would be easy to remember him only as the scandalous boy pope, the dissolute youth who turned a holy palace into a house of vice. And that reputation is not wholly undeserved, but to leave it there would be to miss the deeper meaning of his life. He was, above all, a product of his time and of his father's ambition. A young man placed by others in an impossible position, and then condemned for failing to rise above it. He never chose the priesthood. He was raised to be a prince and made a pope by force of an oath, sworn over an apostle's tomb before he was old enough to understand what was being promised on his behalf. And the tragedy of his life was the unbridgeable distance between those two things. He was the wrong man for the highest office in the West, put there by someone who loved him and wished to protect him, and destroyed in the end by the very contradiction at the heart of his existence. His greatest act, the crowning of Otto, outlived him by 800 years. The empire he revived in that February ceremony would shape the politics of Europe until the dawn of the modern age. A vast and lasting consequence, flowing from one desperate young man's search for a protector. And his deposition by a council, however irregular, planted a question that would trouble the Church for centuries. Whether and how a pope might be judged and removed, and where the line truly lay between the spiritual power of the papacy and the worldly power of kings. The frivolous youth, almost without meaning to, stood at one of the great turning points of medieval history, and the choices he made in his short and chaotic life sent ripples across the centuries that followed. He was not a great man, but he lived and died at the centre of great events, and that is reason enough to remember him. And now, as our story comes gently to its close, let your thoughts begin to settle. We have travelled a long way tonight, through the ruined streets of old Rome, through the schemes of a powerful family, through the short, strange life of the boy they made a pope. The towers have faded now, the basilicas are dark, the voices of the chroniclers have grown quiet, one by one. There is nothing left to do but rest. If you are still awake, there is another quiet journey waiting for you, ready whenever you wish to drift further into the past. And if this one gave you peace, you might like or subscribe or leave a thought below. But let all of that wait until morning. The history will still be there when you wake. It has waited 1,000 years already. It can wait one more night. Relax your body. Let your shoulders sink. Let your breathing slow. Close your eyes, sleep well, and sweet dreams.